Coming to you from the distant city of board gaming, Omaha, Nebraska. Welcome to the Out of the Dust podcast. I'm your host, Pioneer Bryce. Tied in with the popular recurring Out of the Dust geek list on Board Game Geek, the Out of the Dust podcast is a bi-weekly podcast that is focused on re-exploring games we play that we hadn't previously played in a year or more. Why did the game get dusty? Why did you decide to dust it off? How does the game compare to how you remembered it? Are you likely to play it more often in the future? These are the questions that we're interested in examining on Out of the Dust. This week on the podcast, episode 65, on the Out of the Dust segment, I'll bring Mansions of Madness 2nd edition Out of the Dust, and a contributor will dust off Tokaido. On the reaction segment, I react to how the coronavirus has impacted gaming online. On the What I've Been Playing segment, I review On the Underground, London, Berlin. On the Obscure Bryce Game segment, I review History of the World. And we wrap up the episode by starting a countdown of the top 5 games of 2015. I had a chance to bring Mansions of Madness 2nd edition Out of the Dust recently. Mansions of Madness 2nd edition was released in 2016 from publisher Fantasy Flight and designer Nikki Valens. The first edition of Mansions of Madness was one of my most played games for a while, mostly because it had such an insane setup time that I always made sure to play it multiple times at once to get the most out of my time investment. I got the second edition shortly after its release and was excited at the prospect that the new edition would solve my only complaint with the game, the ridiculous setup time. But the game got dusty, and I last played it 2 years, 11 months, and 15 days ago. But I know why it's been so long. It wasn't long after my initial plays before I discovered that the new edition had substituted the crazy setup time with very lengthy scenarios instead. Some of those scenario lengths intimidated me, and I didn't return to the game again until recently when my wife, who is a fan of the system, wanted to re-explore the game while she's recovering from an injury. That, combined with the social distancing that is keeping us home most of the time, does lead us to have some extra time on hand. So I dug the game out from the bottom of my Fantasy Flight pile. I had to clean up the box because it was so dusty, but the play actually went really smoothly, and we did another one right after the first. We lost the introductory scenario both times, but came agonizingly close on the second try. Supposedly, this is an easy scenario, but we've lost 4 times to it now. I might suggest we try the next scenario if we manage to return to the game as we hope, without it getting so dusty again first. I still like that the second edition is able to utilize a lot of the components from the first edition, and we have plenty of those components that aren't being used while we beat our heads against the introductory scenario wall. Let's see what a contributor brought out of the dust. Brandon M., username JB Moby, brought Tokaido out of the dust. He last played it 2 years and 11 months ago. He writes, "The app went free, and I have been playing it with my wife and my parents who are in Florida. It's great implementation, even if a private table isn't really private. We constantly had people crashing our private game with friends table and could only get 2 5-player games going after 10 to 15 minutes of picking characters, muttering, 'Who the heck is Montessori teacher?' Exiting the game, and trying again with similar frustrating results. We might try it again for play with my parents in Florida, but we have been doing a lot of Jackbox via Hangouts lately, and that is much easier to get going. Also, side note, I typically don't log digital plays, but A, these are desperate times, and B, I'm playing with people that I know and love. These games count." Thanks for the contribution, Brandon. I like that you mentioned logging digital plays. I'll have something to say about that in the next segment. Reaction segment time. I'm continuing my coronavirus board gaming observations this week with a look at how myself and others are using online gaming to maintain connections. I've always been a fan of maintaining a few ongoing online games at the major online gaming sites like Yucata, Board Game Arena, and Boîte. I'm still doing a handful of turn-based games at those sites, but I'm definitely playing more live games too. It's been great to reconnect with a couple of my oldest friends, Kent and Beth, who live in a different state. We've been playing one or more live games at BGA every few nights or so, and thanks to Zoom, or the Facebook Messenger audio call feature, it's really easy to open up an audio connection with them too, both for the purposes of in-game conversation and giving instructions. I was able to teach them Clans of Caledonia the other night, which went really smoothly. My regular Wednesday night gaming group has been actively meeting up online as well. Clans of Caledonia is also a popular choice with them, but I was very excited to be able to learn Palaces of Carrera from one of them recently too. I'm looking forward to teaching them La Granja soon, which is the latest game to be implemented at both Yucata and BGA. Judging by the shakeups in the most recently most played list compiled on BGG, I'm not the only one taking advantage of these sites. There are a lot of popular games at those sites suddenly appearing on those lists, which also indicates that people are not feeling guilty about logging their online plays, which I am very excited to see. I've long been an advocate of logging your plays, regardless of the media format through which they are experienced, but historically a lot of people have looked down on that for no good reason and with flimsy excuses of one variety or another. But there are clearly a lot of online and app-based plays being logged, and I fully support that. A game is a game, whether you play it physically or not, and by the same extension, a play is a play. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the more complicated and player count-specific games that don't have an online presence are seeing a decrease in logged plays. There's really not much that can be done about that. There are sadly going to be some games that necessarily have to suffer during a period of social distancing, but I imagine those same games will see a spike when social distancing guidelines are able to be relaxed. In the meantime, I've been surprised at some of the piece-heavy and complex games that do have a presence, especially through portals like Tabletop Simulator and Tabletopia. Australia's at Tabletopia, for instance, and I'd love to find someone to play that with during this period. A lot of podcasts are giving their opinions of these online gaming sites, so I'll run through them myself to close out the segment this week. I have no opinion, first of all, on Tabletop Simulator. It has a program that requires a download and for which I am not confident it would run on my laptop. I haven't explored it at all yet. But I did check out Tabletopia, which runs in a browser window like the more mainstream sites, and I like what I've seen so far. There are a huge variety of games available there that aren't found anywhere else, and if you've got the time to manually manipulate all the pieces yourself and already know how to play the game you want to play, I can see it being a great candidate for delivering a lot of fun, especially for the most seasoned of hobby gamers. Board Game Arena definitely has the best overall implementation. It's quick to set up and find games about to start, and the games run very quickly. They have a solid selection of games from across the spectrum to make any type of gamer happy, but I personally prefer the selection of games over at Yucata, mainly because they have such a high quantity of stuff and filled games there. Their interface is solid, and the site enjoys the benefit of an undo button, which is something BGA doesn't always have. As for Boîte à Jeux, it's clearly the lesser platform of all of them, but still worth creating an account for since all of its games are free, and most of its games are unique to it. It seems to particularly specialize in two-player games and has just about all of the GIF series, which is certainly notable. If any of my listeners want to hit me up for a game during social isolation time, feel free to do so. My username at Yucata is Silverberg14, inspired by my favorite writer, Robert Silverberg. And my username at both BGA and Boîte à Jeux is Anne_Lee, that's L-E-E, numerals 1-4, which is a shortened form of my favorite poem, Annabelle Lee. This week on the What I've Been Playing segment, I'm going to tell you about On the Underground, London Berlin, the recently fulfilled deluxe edition Kickstarter from Ludi Creations that re-implemented the fairly obscure On the Underground from Rio Grande. This route-building game is designed by Sebastian Blisdale, who is best known as the co-designer of Keyflower. This was a last-minute backing decision on my part when it was on Kickstarter last year, and I probably wouldn't have done so if I didn't have some extra funds at the time that put me over the edge. But I'm glad I did back it, because I've been super impressed with the game since receiving it, and getting it to the table. Here's how it works. Depending on player count, players use 2 or more colors of track to connect to various locations on the map and manipulate how the passenger in the game gets from point A to point B. Players do this by spending 4 actions on their turn, building additional pieces of track in any of their colors, or by taking a branch token. Usually, all track placements must be attached to an end piece of the same color, but a branch token, as the name implies, allows a player to create branching segments in their route. After spending their 4 actions, then the passenger moves. A deck of silver and gold-colored destination cards determines where the passenger moves next, and there are 4 of these on display at the beginning of the passenger's movement. The passenger always alternates moving gold-silver, unless there is more than 2 of those colors in play, in which case the passenger will skip over the color in the sequence if it is no longer available as a destination. The rules for which routes the passenger travels along is super important, as the passenger will always choose the destination and route that requires the least amount of walking, aka spaces without track built on them yet. If this requirement is the same between 2 eligible destinations, then the player chooses which one the passenger goes to next. but the passenger will always get to that destination by taking a sequence of tracks that requires them to switch colors of tracks the least frequently. Players earn points for connecting their colors of tracks to various types of locations on the map, and each time the passenger travels over one of their colors. So players must continuously manipulate where their colors of track leads so that the passenger moves along their lines more often than their opponents. This creates an intense and delightful logistical puzzle, and I love it. Figuring out the most efficient way of laying down track to yield points and divert the passenger along my routes at the same time leaves me feeling very satisfied and tactically fulfilled. In fact, this game has blown me away. I am super impressed with it, and everyone I've introduced it to so far has been impressed as well. It's a tight, elegant design that is quick to teach and quick to open up to people. It's even got one of the best solo modes I've encountered recently as well. A deck of historical lines gives the game a bunch of starting tracks on the board and a huge head start in points, and players must make up that difference throughout the game while the AI continues scoring points before the deck of destination cards runs out. I'm usually happy playing any given solo game once a night, but I keep finding myself playing On the Underground multiple times in a row, both solo and multiplayer, because it is so addicting. Obscure Bryce Game segment time. This week on the podcast, I'm going to tell you about History of the World, a 1991 Avalon Hill area control game from designers Gary Dicken, Steve Kendall, and Phil Kendall. This game started off as a bookcase series-sized game before it was reprinted as part of the Avalon Hill large box series, the same series that featured the Queen's Gambit to the dice version of Acquire. It's a solid 3 or 4 hour game depending on how many players are playing, and the game was re-implemented as the amusingly titled A Brief History of the World, which shortened the game from 7 epochs to 6, and shaved a half hour or so from the game. Most recently, the game was re-implemented as the Z-Man version of History of the World, which shortened the game yet again to 5 epochs, streamlined a few things, and introduced variable player powers to the game. Despite this admirable history, the game is seldom played in any of its variations, accumulating only a handful of logged plays a month on BGG. I first became aware of the game at the height of my CCG days. On occasion, just to switch things up, my friends and I would play a board game of some sort instead of our current CCG obsession. One of my friends, Jason Bell, is a big area control game fan, and it must be about 17 years ago now or so, when he first taught me History of the World. I was immediately taken with it, borrowed it, played it with my wife, who loved it, and then acquired the nice big box edition myself, back when it was still readily available. Here's how it works. The game is divided into 7 epochs. During each epoch, each player will play a different historical empire. A player's pieces are all the same color, but each epoch uses a different sculpt of mini. The players draft these empires by randomly selecting one and then choosing to either keep it or pass it to another player. Each empire acts in a specific order during the epoch and comes with a different quantity of armies, a starting location, a capital or city, and maybe navigation tokens that dictate which seas and or oceans the empire can expand across. These are important factors to consider when deciding to keep or pass an empire, as well as what armies are already on the board, where, and owned by which player. But in any event, when it's a player's turn to act, they will use their allotment of armies to expand their empire across as much of the board as possible. Expanding into an empty territory is as simple as just placing an army there. Expanding into a territory controlled by an army of the same color from an earlier epoch simply requires replacing the piece in question and is useful to get from one place to another without conflict. But expanding into an opponent-controlled territory requires combat die rolls. These rolls are modified by cards and terrain, but ultimately come down to whoever rolled higher, with ties going to the defender. But unlike a game like Risk, for example, the size of a player's army is not a factor, as only one army can occupy any given territory at a time. The modifiers are far more important, and the limited bank of an empire's armies ensures one player is never going to cover the entire Earth. After the empire has expanded as much as possible, they score points for each region on the map. Each region is worth a certain number of points for players who dominate it completely with only their pieces, control it with a majority of pieces, or merely occupy it with at least one piece. The cool thing is that the points for these regions increase and decrease from one epoch to the next based upon the region's historical impact for the epoch in question. For example, China is worth points for the entire game, but North America is only worth points for the last couple of epochs. The historical simulation that the point value of each region is worth really drives this game and makes it stand out amongst other area control games, even more recent ones. The ebb and fall of regions' points makes for an interesting strategic decisions as players weigh which empires to draft and where exactly to expand them. There's a lot of risk-reward analysis that goes into these decisions. My wife likes the game because of the history it's based on and because of the interesting alternate history that unfolds as the game progresses. It's always very fascinating to see which empires rise and fall more or less successfully than they did in real life. My wife and I have a competition to see how many early empire pieces manage to last the entire game. But my favorite part of the game has to be that empire draft each epoch. Everything comes back to that. I love the psychology and subtle tension this simple decision brings to the table. Despite the frequency of dice rolls, history of the world is not won by rolling well or not. It's won in the empire draft and successfully manipulating who gets which empire win. When a player manages to end an epoch with a successful expansion, then lead off the next epoch in a favorable part of the world, and rack up huge amounts of points back to back, that's an infinitely satisfying feeling. All of these things ultimately make History of the World one of my few perfect 10 rated games. It's a top 10 game of all time for me, and one I'm always happy to bring to the table. The Dice Tower has been doing this cool thing where they count down their top 10 games from 5, 10, 15, and 20 years ago. Inspired by that, I'm going to put my own little spin on that and review the top 5 games ranked on BGG from 5 years ago and compare them to my own personal top 5 games from 5 years ago and see how they compare. This episode will cover number 5 on each list. The 5th most popular game on BGG from 2015 is Blood Rage, a game I coincidentally just brought out of the dust recently. A lot of people don't know that Blood Rage is a re-implementation of Eric Lang's older game, Midgard. And in fact, that's why I wasn't initially interested in Blood Rage myself. I owned Midgard and thought it was a fine game, but not good enough to essentially buy over again. Eventually I acquired a copy of Blood Rage, but not until a great deal fell into my lap. I thought the changes were all positive ones though, but all things considered, I think Blood Rage is overrated on BGG. It wouldn't appear on my top 50 list, and I like Rising Sun better. I like Blood Rage every now and then, but I'm really excited for the upcoming Ankh. My personal number 5 game of 2015 is The Game, the themeless Spiel des Jahres nominated number arrangement game from designer Stefan Bendorf. 5 years later, The Game is my 4th most played game of all time. It's addicting, challenging, and genuinely fulfilling when you win. The tension that mounts as the game progresses is intense. I love it when I'm able to string together multiple cards that send a stack backwards. What a great feeling that is. But the rare moments when a perfect game happens are truly elating. The game works great as an app too. There are some alternate modes on the app that are pleasant for a different kind of solo diversion. I'm really looking forward to when the spin-off competitive face-to-face game becomes readily available. I will definitely be picking that up when I see it. Well, that will do it for episode 65. Thanks for listening. Feel free to join the Out of the Dust Podcast Guild at BoardGameGeek.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter at Out of the Dust BGG. Leave a comment at the Guild, PM me on BGG under user handle Radagast14, or email me at radagast14@centurylink.net, and join the Out of the Dust conversation yourself at our monthly geek list at BGG. Alright, play me out, Ananda!